Support for Iowa Catholic Radio and the Uncommon Good provided by Mercy College of Health Sciences. Learn more at mchs.edu.
Welcome, folks, to the Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Every week, diving deep into the truth of Catholic social teaching and restoring all things in Christ.
The Uncommon Good is on the air. I'm Bo Bonner.
I'm Dr. Bud Marr, and I almost forgot to lean up to my microphone. I was like, oh, Bo's doing this radio show. This should be entertaining.
You're just going to watch.
Yeah,
You're
just
like,
observe.
I have the best seat in the house.
I'm doing an evaluation over here. Oh, that was well said.
Well, already this intro is pretty A+. You can tell. This is the Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr. Here on Iowa Catholic Radio, we love to have you with us. Whether you're listening on Iowa Catholic Radio's vast network of radio outlets through antennae, transmitting waves through space, or on the iowacatholicradio.com with your bits and computers, Iowa Catholic Radio app with your phones that you're probably... I knocked over my microphone. You're carrying with you wherever you go. And, of course, our good podcast listeners, thank you for listening to the show. We want to thank Mercy College of Health Sciences for underwriting the show. I am the senior advisor for Mission Initiatives, the director for the Center for Human Flourishing there at Mercy. Sorry,
Yeah.
Bud, what do you do over there?
Yeah, we're right downtown. I'm the Dean of Liberal Arts and Sciences, so working with our math, science, history. Well, I don't know if we have a history professor. We do have some philosophy, some writing, English.
History shows up in so many ways.
Oh, it is woven in there.
Interwoven
We love
history.
the history of the Sisters of Mercy who founded our college.
Absolutely. So if you want to be a part of that healing ministry of the sisters and you want to learn a trade, be instructed in work that will be a shining lamp for people in need, Mercy College is the place to do that. Thank you for underwriting our show, mchs.edu. But I'm sort of hurrying around because I know we have an interview with a wonderful book about parenting with our friend Holly Taylor Coolman. So I want to make sure that we jump to it. But before I do, how you survive in the heat?
Oh, I survive heat fine.
It's me you're worried about.
I do like the adage, the saying, yeah, I'm a little worried about you. Like they're always like, you can shed clothing. Well, I mean, that's not always prudent.
To a point.
Yeah.
Yeah, I always am like, you can add clothing.
Oh, that's probably the better tact. I think I am actually flipping the way it's normally phrased.
Just whatever season you're in, you're like making it okay.
In winter, like we tell our kids, like, we'll put a scarf on.
Layers.
They're like, Dad, I shouldn't have to wear a scarf in the house.
Yeah, I mean, oh man.
Rachel and I are pretty thrifty when it comes to air control.
Yeah.
But we do have a great show. Holly Taylor Coolman.
The parenting
book.
The complex and beautiful vocation of raising children. We're going to talk to Holly when we get back here. Stick around. This is The Uncommon Good. We'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. Today we're going to talk with Dr. Holly Taylor Coolman, Assistant Professor of Theology at Providence College, who has written a new book, Parenting, the Complex and Beautiful Vocation of Raising Children. Holly, thank you for joining the show.
Thank you all so much for having me on.
So if you don't mind setting this up before we get into it deeper, what did drive you to write about parenting? Did people approach it? Did all of your children in unison beg you to write a book? What was it that sparked this idea to write this book?
Yeah, oddly enough, it was the children. They all just came to the dinner table one night and said, you know what we really want you to do? Write a book about all this. Yeah, it's crazy. No, that's not what happened. Though I have to say also, it also was not the case that I myself just dreamed up the idea of writing a book on parenting, thought that's what I should do next. Let me start working on that. It came about through a couple different kinds of, I'd say, kind of real life, concrete experience and sort of serendipity, maybe providence. So a couple different things I could say. First of all, I just found that as our own children, my husband's and my children, kind of moving through adolescence and into young adulthood, and we've gotten through that really first big phase of active parenting. I do think that parenting continues, but I just found that more and more friends and acquaintances and sometimes people I didn't know very well at all who were parenting a little bit behind me, so to speak, were coming to me to say, hey, can I talk to you about X? Can I talk to you about Y? Or even, honestly, sometimes just this is what we're in the middle of. Could you please pray for us? Knowing that, I'd had some experience in this world. And I found that as I engaged with them on different questions and concerns that they had, I really heard myself, in a sense, saying some of the same things repeatedly. I started feeling like I wish I could just, get these three things out on the table for all of these younger parents. And of course, what that does is it forms sort of the nucleus of a book in a way. And then it's funny, I also had an old friend, even more specifically, who came to me. He was editing a series and asked me if I would be willing to write one of the books in this series, all of which were aimed at some real life experiences, but for pastors, ministers, people who are accompanying folks through these moments. Kind of talked about maybe I would write that book on adoption. Then we ended up expanding out to just parenting. And then in the end, the publisher just decided that maybe this manuscript had a little broader life. But it's interesting because it was written very much with those kinds of folks in mind, not only parents, in other words, but also people who are walking alongside parents in different ways. And I think that changes the tone maybe a little bit. I'm not inclined overall to sort of be shaking my finger at parents and telling them what to do. But I think I would say that only contributed to a certain kind of way that I want to come to the subject, which is with a little bit of indirectness that, sort of come, let us reason together about parenting. What's going on here, And certainly not taking any kind of simple, do X if you want to get Y result.
One thing I appreciated about the book is it's very realistic about the pressures on families today and on parents. So we've built an economy that values mobility. And because of that, there's less connection oftentimes to extended family. Many households have to have two incomes to stay afloat. And all of those kind of pressures make parenting a more challenging task. It's already, by virtue of, its intrinsic nature, a difficult thing. Could you talk some about how parishes could speak to that reality, or even, I think in the book you get into some kind of creative ways of meeting those needs or filling those gaps?
I mean, for my money, a big part of this is simply that parishes and again, pastors and folks who are working directly with families need to begin with that assumption. I actually think that parenting is made significantly harder by these dynamics. I think you could picture a world, at least, in which parenting, of course, takes a lot of time and is a very big part of life, but is not so inherently difficult or confusing or exhausting. And so I think partly the first step here is just for all of us together to say that. Very high levels of mobility, although we think nothing of it. We think nothing of a family picking up and moving across 3 states. I mean, it creates a to-do list, but you just check that off. Whereas the fallout, I think, for a family, I'll just tell you again, this is something I ended up talking to younger families about. And I said, you need to give yourself a bare minimum of a year to try to recover from that kind of a move. That's just an enormous dent in family life. Okay, so insofar as they're able to do that and say, families really are working in a situation where what is considered normal is actually very difficult, then I think you can start to step in, ask about the specifics of your own community, ask about the specifics of your own parish. This is going to depend, I think, a lot on things like culture and economic realities for those families. And then start to ask, what would this parish do if we were a kind of extended family? If it were your niece who was, finding herself going back to work with a 6-month-old and a 3-year-old, how would you want to step into your niece's life, et cetera, et cetera? I think I would start with, it's actually not a perfect analogy, and I think there are questions to be raised about this, but I think that, the image of an extended family is a place to start.
In light of that, this is a dead horse I'm always kicking, that phronesis, this idea of practical wisdom, is lacking in many of the ways that the church or just the world approaches very important topics such as parenting. And so, we just got done with, Father's Day wasn't too long ago, Mother's Day, the month before. And, at that point, people like to wax ecstatic and with high, ivory tower poetry, right? Like, ye titans of the future, I love thee, mom and dad. Or you got books that are like, here's 14 steps to make sure your daughter doesn't text while she drives. But this middle voice, right, of how do we all take a step or two back to ask the questions that would make you consider. And then also, when we're teaching, don't provide the answers because, as you say repeatedly in this book, you just have to take time to ask yourself what truly is a goal, that, like how you understand where you're heading towards in your life as a parent and as a family. And do you ever take time to ever do that? Your book is replete with admonishments, gentle ones, to do this. And to be honest, that's what I appreciate the most about your book out of the gate, is if people are tired of hearing just, flowery language about the family or dire prognostications, or on the flip side, they're tired of just, here's lists of things to do. Your book is wonderfully indeterminate in that way, which I think sometimes people forget how much new parents need that instead of just being hammered, you need to do these next 5 things next.
So I agree with you completely on the need for us to sort of rediscover the whole world of practical wisdom. I don't know all the causes, but for whatever reason, we've moved into a moment where, maybe it is amidst a lot of stresses and a lot of uncertainties. We are also finding ourselves just surrounded by templates. This is how you do it. This is how you do it right. And I'm a fan of practical proposals. And I think that there certainly are some practical proposals that tend to work in a lot of different situations. In fact, those are some of the ones that I tried to offer in the book. But that is how those should be framed. For Catholic parents, I would say this very specifically. The church, in all her wisdom, helps us know what the non-negotiable obligations of the faith are. And it's not our place to step in and create a whole world of additional requirements on top of that. Our job is to step in, and again, not only as individuals, not even only as married couples, but as communities also, all of those ways, to sort of do that work. Imagining and thinking and talking together, for me, that is one of the enormous values that's present in finding community, is that it gives you that gift of reflection and conversation. That's where you get that work done, right? It's fine that sometimes those really take the form of somewhat urgent problem solving, but somewhat urgent problem solving really only makes sense if it's embedded in this longer practice of sort of more leisurely kinds of interaction and conversation. And, I often think of my paternal grandparents in this regard, who were both dyed-in-the-wool Southerners, and they spent a lot of time in their life visited with people, their old friends who were going to come and visit. And as a young child, I spent a lot of time with them, watching them visit and learning what that looked like. And that, I think, is something that's very easy for us to just pass right over and not even know everything that we're missing.
I hope my question doesn't cut against the grain of what Bo was celebrating there, because I'm not looking for a 6-step plan necessarily, but in my own parenting journey, I'm entering the stage where I have to have practical wisdom about the use of technology, especially with smartphones. I don't know, could you give us a sneak preview of what you discussed in the book and sort of like the vision that you've cast for some of your older children maybe?
I can absolutely do that. And to be honest with you, one of my own convictions about this new challenge of managing screens, which I can tell you, as I've talked about this book and interacted with folks about this book, this is often either the first or the second thing that comes up. We are all trying to figure this out together at the same time. So I was going to say, one of my convictions is it does not make sense for each family to try to figure this out from scratch. It's really wise for us to be thinking about it together. And I do think there are absolutely sort of guide rails that we can and should consider putting in place, allowing, of course, for the possibility that individual families and individual kids are going to have their specific needs. But, for example, this is not an innovation of mine, but I've pointed people to it. it's very easy now to find a growing consensus about the following guide rail. Kids should not have smartphones in any way, shape, or form until 8th grade, and maybe until 9th grade. Some people make that 9th grade. And they should not have any access to social media until they're 16 years old. Now, does that perfect for everybody? No. People may want to be earlier, later, whatever. But at least it gives you a place to start, because I think one of the huge challenges, I say this in the book, with technology is simply the fact that things have changed so fast that not only can you not start with the way your parents did it, you may not even be able to start with the way your oldest sister did it. I say to folks, my kids, our 5 kids are now ranging between the ages of 26 and as of yesterday, 16, 26 to 16. And in that span of time, I feel like my kids belong to 2 different generations. I think there are 2 markedly different generations in my children. Mm-hmm. So it just really helps. And you just think about anything that you do as a parent. What are you going to say to your children about, socializing or dating? What are you going to say to your children about eating at the dinner table? It goes on and on and on. What we all start with is some kind of template that was handed to us.
I feel like, that as you get older, that sort of like, when I went to school, like we walked uphill in snow both directions or whatever. Right. Like that's particularly acute for our generation. Like it kind of blows my mind, but my first email account was my freshman year of college. My kids, so many experiences that they have. When I tell them like how I experienced it, like I was trying to explain going to Blockbuster on Friday night recently, and it just sort of blew their minds.
See, but this is like, because Bud lived in a more normal household. I was telling my kids stuff I did growing up. I was like, yeah, well, we were having rock war. And they're like, what's rock war, Dad? It can't be you were throwing rocks at each other. And I'm like, we were throwing rocks at each other.
Oh, wow. We did dirt clods.
Nah, we did rocks. Oklahoma did it for real. It was for keeps.
True Okies.
Yeah, but like even the idea of like, that's a good point, how much safety there is that sort of addresses a lot of things. See, so Holly, the mistake you made that you didn't know is you mentioned Marshall McLuhan at least once. And so now I'm going to go off on this. I'm glad you did, right? We shape our tools and then our tools shape us. What I think is interesting, you go back, you say, you had Southern parents, I did too. Visiting, without the G, very important, right, to like socializing. But that's because the sort of way that orality in an oral-based culture survived through a lot of changes in medium, but the speed of the change of our sort of mediums of communication really do matter about how we parent. So I even thought about this, that this is a book. This is a book on parenting, right? And so it's interesting, right? Like here we are going to make a podcast, and that probably makes sense because I'm guessing that if we have a chance for someone to read your book, a certain age group, having kids, they will more likely hear the podcast first and then connect to it. But the one thing that I try to throw out with students, and I think this is true with kids too, even if you don't give your kids the smartphones before 16, they are digital children. They have been formed in a digital age. And even when my kids are talking about, like, I make them play older video games, mostly because I can beat them in those games, they still are talking about it in terms of, like digital life. And so I've tried to press this before with parents that remediation, which always gets a sort of negative connotation, literally just means to come back around to a certain sort of media. And we have to remediate kids to like text-based world if they're going to go into academia, at least how academia is formed now. But parents need to be remediated. They have these foreigners who are digital natives in their house. And part of this accompaniment that I keep seeing you talk about, and I saw it through the technology chapter too, I think that that's one of the greatest things we all have to sort of, like literally in the philosophical sense, come to terms with. What does it mean to remediate to a world enough that we're not trying to like be dorky tech people we'll never be because we're too old, but that we'll understand where our digital native children are coming from?
Yeah, I agree with you completely. And in a sense, I actually appreciate the larger picture that you're painting right now, because I think it helps to avoid just a simplistic assumption that sort of text is better and images are bad. I mean, images came first. Mm-hmm. Human beings dealt with images long before we dealt with text. But it's just helpful to be very aware that these are different kinds of media and they do different things. And again, given the speed of the change that both you and I have referred to, it's crucial right now to be unblinking about some of the ways that those media are now consumed. And I'll just give you 2 examples quickly. So to engage a world of images, of course, is nothing new at all. But to engage a world of images in massive, extreme isolation is very unusual. That is very new.
Oh, yeah.
I give you a brightly colored glowing square, and you go in your individual bedroom. And that's where you're going to engage with image. That's very strange. And we just need to be clear-eyed about that and ask, well, what does that look like? What does that mean? And the second thing that I would say about this, something that I have to say, more strident about with every passing day is, one of the things that's new here is the reality of persuasive technology.
Yeah.
So parents have to be absolutely clear that folks in Silicon Valley are creating technologies that they most often do not allow their own children access to.
Absolutely.
Because they know what they're creating. They're creating technology that is meant to prevent you from getting off it. So, yeah, I would say, you mentioned accompaniment. I actually think there is nothing more important than parents do than to try to look for ways to walk alongside their kids. But I would also say, if you read the book, I'm a fan of some nice, clear limits too. I say to parents, there simply is no question that you will monitor and you will filter. You will monitor and you will filter. There's no option of doing neither one of those things, in my view, for parents. The only question is how, when, why, and how will you find ways to do that in ways that are, at least in important ways, allied with your kids. They don't always have to like it, that's fine, but that they feel allied, that you are allied with them.
See, and this is great. We're over time, but I like my point too much, Bud. Sorry, I'm going to be rude. What I think is really telling about this is you have to monitor content. Like, I'm not saying anything as silly as that. There's obviously like good content and bad content. The big medial change, right, is instead of like a road to perdition where you're like, you had to literally walk down and you're like, hey, son, if the alley is full of people with like, trench coats and none of them's looking in the eye, don't go into that door. But now it's a portal, right? And like, boom, you're in this area. Okay. What you have to be against is not just the content, but the context. And so I throw out to people is anything that is gamified, even if the content is great, you should take your kids off of it. And that means, and so hot take, prayer apps, language apps, some that might have an owl or that Mark Wahlberg likes, for instance, if it gamifies the faith or it gamifies even good things, I would suggest not letting your kids do those just as much so that they don't associate gamification with the best things in life too. With that, with spitting fire towards very popular apps, we're going to go hit a break. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. With The Uncommon Good, Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. It is wonderful to have you with us. Today we are speaking with Dr. Holly Taylor Coolman, who is an assistant professor of theology at Providence College and senior fellow of the Principium Institute. We are talking about her new book, Parenting, the Complex and Beautiful Vocation of Raising Children. Holly, thank you again for coming on to the show.
Thank you.
Now, I'm being honest. You weren't here. You just have to trust me. When you talk about map making and apprenticeship, first of all, I love both of them. We can get into all sorts of ways about how parenting is map making and apprenticeship. I love that. Of all the chapters, I love that one. But just to tell you, I had two children who were going through, they just got confirmed. And what I made them do to prove to me that they were ready to be confirmed is they both had to like make maps of the faith and present it to their younger siblings. And if their younger siblings got it after asking questions, I said that they could go be confirmed. So this idea of map making the minute you saw it, I'm calling my lawyers. I'm accusing you of plagiarism. No, I mean, I don't know. Like we said this in the first segment. You know, we were all at Duke at a similar time. I don't know if this is like People in the Water with Stanley Hauerwas or what. But the minute I read that, I was like, goodness gracious, I've been using the map making metaphor for my family for a long time. So I love it. But if you don't mind throwing out particularly how you point out that this might be a new way to think about parenting versus perhaps more what I'm going to call utilitarian models that predominate how most people talk about parenting.
Yeah, sure. So for me, I think it had a kind of attractiveness for a couple of different reasons. One is that as I thought about life, but especially as I thought about faith, I was certainly looking for a way to communicate to folks that we are doing much more than simply absorbing certain beliefs that could be stated in sentence form and then sharing those, repeating those beliefs to our children. And really even more than passing along habits to them, like attending Mass on a Sunday morning. That there's something richer, more complicated and more nuanced. And also, again, you know, as we're sort of alluding to briefly in the first part of our conversation, something that will also be importantly individual to each parent and to each couple that is raising children together. I really wanted to say that too. You have made your map, so you're going to know about some locations really well, and you're going to have lots of opportunity to tell your kids about that. Other locations you may not know as much about, but you may just want to say, you know, I've heard that the Riviera is beautiful at this time of year, and you might want to go there. So for me, it was just, it was a model that allowed for a lot of different possibilities. And again, if nothing else, it sort of invites readers, it's intended to invite readers into asking this question: what are we doing? What are you doing if you're not simply repeating beliefs or enacting habits? What more complicated things are you up to with your kids?
Well, and on this note, just to make the point about how wonderfully refulgent and different, but baseline family resemblance this can be. So when I threw this out to my kids, I admit I was thinking like Legend of Zelda map, right? Like, you know, so like it's sort of how what you said, like what's in the center and what are in the peripheries and how are they connected? But both of them went with maps about getting somewhere, which when I was starting to think about it, I was like, oh, okay, well, they're getting ready to be confirmed. I can understand the sort of like, but my son, who's on the autism spectrum, he very much was like, he drew a map. He's like, these are stopping points, you know, and I realized, when I read that chapter, I was like, a lot of my parenting with him, I am like thinking of it he's thinking of it in terms of like Apple directions or whatever. And that's what he's thinking about. It's like, okay, so I want to get to where are the way stops along the way? Where are we going to make decisions? And then my daughter, she's a bit more like me. She sort of gave a narrative map of like, well, I'm walking along and this is what you do and this is what you do and this is what you do. So again, they had a specific thing I threw out there, but the way they talked about the map, one was intensely, like we've said, visual. Another one was very auditory and narrative, but it could be so many different ways for people. And then that visiting, right? Like the importance of having a community to visit, instead of just needing to like go, okay, which side of these huge parental arguments are you on? Now we can compare maps, which is just a lot less antagonistic to begin with. And so again, I can't throw out more that point to people to start thinking about the map of parenting a child rather than what you're saying is the sort of behaviorist understanding of these things.
Yeah, gosh, and those sort of, and it seems like they're always polarized. Those polarized kinds of discussions we get into, it really does often seem like it's going to be either A or B. Pick now, when you find out that you're expecting your first baby, just decide which parenting strategy you'll be using. And it's just not that there aren't, not that there isn't wisdom to be found in certain approaches. They are really founded in many cases on helpful and thoughtful kinds of assumptions. But the idea that you're just going to find an approach, is kind of crazy. In fact, I noted very briefly in the introduction to this book, I think it's a symptom in a way, because even the verb, the word, the title of my book, just parenting, is a pretty recent word. Only 100 years ago. Only 100 years ago, almost nobody was talking about parenting their children. You raise children, sure. But I think, I know. I think the verb, well, you say, what's the difference between, parenting and raising children? But I think in reality, that word parenting has precisely become fraught with all the kinds of things that we're talking about. You have to have a strategy, and you have to have an approach, and you have to, and this is to get X result or Y result. So right. I hope that, I do think that maps can help you get places, and I like that about maps. I think about changing technology. Maybe I'm revealing my age here, because I certainly did myself use maps to get places, which you're probably never done. But it's good to get places. We want to get places, but we're also just trying to see. We all are, whether we mean to or not. We're trying to see the lay of the land. And the things that we do depend on how we do that, how we see it. So,
I think as a theologian, like, parenting in the family can be one of the more challenging topics to address. It's fraught with potential pitfalls. In some ways.
Well, because I think you're accusing them, right?
Yeah, I'd almost rather write a treatise on the Trinity than tackle.
That's what I was going to say. Like, you're not going to go rough up some Arians, right? But you are going to have a discussion about people who've made choices.
And I grew up in a Christian context that was very much like focus on the family. And it wasn't until I got to Duke that Stanley Hauerwas, the common teacher of all of us, challenged me to think about, like, well, Jesus wasn't pro-family in that way, and the way we sort of talk about it in American culture today. And I kind of wonder, Holly, if you have thoughts, and this kind of ties back to a question I asked in the first segment about how parishes support parents. Like, how can the church be pro-family without turning it into a kind of idol or something, or speak prophetically? Because I know even at like a practical level, I've met single Christians who say, well, when I go to that church, I don't really feel like I fit in, because it seems like everything is geared towards those who have children, to families. I don't know. I threw a lot out there, but some thoughts on those sorts of topics.
No, that makes sense. And I think in from a certain perspective, this strong emphasis on trying to support families and highlight families and emphasize families is understandable if we believe that we're in a moment where things are really challenging for families, where when we're in a moment, not just this moment, but many, where the formation that happens in the family is in fact going to be so crucial for the future. That's just absolutely correct, but that's right. I think that the temptation there is precise. In fact, I would myself use biblical language for this. I would say the temptation is to make the family itself into an idol, so that it is not a reality that is reflecting divine love and immersed in divine love and fostering love among beloved children of God, but it can slip into becoming an end in itself. And that is, ironically enough, deadly to families. And I would say, just to be very honest about it, I would say I sometimes see that danger in Catholic settings with theology of the body, which we often turn to for alternatives.
Amen.
It's an alternative to the world in which we find ourselves. And people misunderstand theology of the body if they imagine that it offers the life of marriage and family as the ultimate reality. It does not. It's very clear. Family life points to something greater than itself. And of course, precisely in a Catholic setting, that is the way that we see everyone, single or married, drawn into the same divine mystery. But it also, especially specifically, that we see people who are in vowed celibacy, who are, living out kind of what Paul said, aren't they? It's better not to marry. Well, and so if we lose that, we're done for.
And exactly, Paul, right? So Paul establishes this as like in fact, I think this is the radical thing he says is when a man and a woman are married and have children, their greatest, I'm being bombastic, but he's kind of saying the greatest thing you do is actually provide a base analog for spiritual realities, which are higher. And to me, this is interesting about how we talk about it. Like I'm usually trying to self-police myself to not advocate for incredibly dorky terms over layman's terms. It's talking about being practically wise. But I got one that I'm almost to the point of doing. So Leo the 13th in Arcane, I forget what the second one is, but it's his first big encyclical on the family. He doesn't talk about the family. He talks about domestic society. And there's a way in which domestic society is so weird and sounds strange that I'm almost for saying it as much as possible because I think it sort of allows us to get out of a few intellectual ruts that family kind of has us stuck in. And this goes back, I think, to the apprenticeship part that you're talking about. What is the apprenticeship? The apprenticeship is being a human living in a world. So this is why the apprenticeships and the maps to me fit together so well, is you're not, it's like you said, parenting gets this idea that you can be an expert and have expertise at this thing called parenting instead of, no, we're all actually trying to master this thing called life, and you're helping these humans master humanness. And then, of course, grace, right? And I think all of that gets into, like, family, focus on the family, the idol. It's a thing you do. Parenting is an expertise. It's just this like it's like this narrow focus that can make it seem like this anxious movie that we're living in. In domestic society, look, Leo the 13th, his whole thing is to say, if you're going to stand against sort of the prince of this age, the devil, and humans overweening hubris, we have to be serious that the domestic society owes its allegiance first to God. And that's what you're doing first, right? Is the apprenticeship is to make citizens of the city of God. And so, I'm not acting like everyone from now on needs to say domestic society, although I'm going to do it.
You'll probably force me to.
Yeah, that's right. But I think some of this word stuff matters. Again, we're a bunch of dookies talking about words. It's almost predictable at this point. But I do think that that's something your book actually hits upon again and again from different angles. Is it's not that we got to think radically different about everything, but we do need to take the time to step back and say, do we start putting ourselves in ruts of our own creation that don't help us as much as we think so in the Christian life?
Right. So just to say quickly for listeners, these are these two big models that I myself just landed on. One, the first is sort of map making. I imagine parents as being people who are kind of sketching out a map, but with a children sitting right next to them, sitting on their lap, watching this happen. It would, kind of powerful form of influence that is. And then secondly, I kind of go back to this traditional model of education, probably the way that most people learned things for a long time, which is that you come as a beginner and you sit alongside somebody who's just been doing it a lot longer and is better, frankly, at it than you are. And, also, apprenticeship is going to include this dynamic whereby the beginner will be invited in little by little, more and more. Really interesting to see how this worked, for example, in the work of Renaissance art, where people are sometimes aware of apprenticeship. First you'll get to mix the paint. Mm-hmm. You'll be allowed to mix the color. Then you'll be allowed to add a little splash on the top of the wave, and then people move toward becoming really painters of complete scenes. And again, both of those are just richer for me. But I do say this explicitly when I'm talking about the model of apprenticing. I think that one of the interesting things about your phrase, domestic society, is that it's actually a little bit more flexible to include people who are living together in a household. It does not have to be strictly limited to a nuclear family. It's not, you include other generations. It's going to include maybe even others who become connected to that household. And I was really thinking about that as I was writing this book, partly because that's the way that my husband and I have largely lived our lives. We often have somebody living in our house who's not a member of our family. At present, we have our oldest daughter and our son-in-law and our granddaughter living with us. That possibility of thinking of something bigger than the nuclear family also means that although I think it's clear that, the norm is that the parent is going to function as the primary master that a child will be sitting next to, there are other people too.
Oh, yeah.
And parenting is, if you are the only one who's pointing things out to your children, who's inviting them to this, who's teaching them how to do that, you are going to be exhausted, and your children are probably going to be a little anxious.
Yes.
It's hard to avoid.
So I'm sorry to interrupt one more time. This made me think, the other day I was explaining to my children that, since they don't see my brother as much, they're missing a really important aspect of what is apprenticeship, which is you really should learn to be a smart aleck from your uncle and not your dad. And I was
tell my brothers.
I'm dead serious about this. One of the things I looked forward to being an uncle is I was and I'll get to make him smart alecks. Because, my kids thought I was joking, and it's another time where my kids think I was joking, but I was like, no, I'm being serious. This is the way I went Mandalorian on them. but to that point, there's just when you have that big domestic society and it's more just a nuclear family, what a relief to not be. If any of my kids want to learn to actually work on cars, they just can't talk to me.
Yeah.
And, or be tactful. So we're hitting up on the time. So Bud, I know you're the king of asking open-ended questions at the very end. Do you have a little slightly less open-ended question that we want to end on here?
Well, I don't know what I've been thinking about is we were joking at the first segment about sort of how the cultural landscape has changed. And I mentioned Blockbuster, buying a CD, something like that. But there's something analogous to my children's spiritual landscape is very different because they're growing up Catholic. They're cradle Catholics. And it's been moving for me to see my 4-year-old cross himself at Mass and how they kind of internalize the faith. But I have a little bit of anxiety because as they get older, I've talked to Catholic parents who, I think for Catholic children to fall away from the faith, it's a different kind of experience because everything is so sacramentally, communally rooted. And I don't know if you had thoughts about how you sort of, as a parent, when your children get to 17, 18, 19, do you pester them about going to Mass, or what sort of MO do you navigate those waters with?
Right. That is a great question. And, in some ways, of course, the question is connected to all the ways that your parenting changes when you have a 17, 18, 19-year-old, which I must report to you is dramatic and a little unnerving. So we absolutely, in every area of their life, we have given our children more freedom. And I'm going to even say it a little bit more strongly than that. We've tried to, it's not always easy, but we've tried to really celebrate the ways in which they move in to more agency and more freedom. And of course, the time that's hardest to do that is when they're not making the decisions that you would make. But they're human beings with a will and with a set of desires. And that's really beautiful to see that unfold. And I'm just going to say briefly that I actually do think there is a really interesting way in which the Catholic faith is so big and so generous. And it, I think God is always able to use a metaphor some people know comes from literature. God's always able to just pull that thread to pull you back. God knows how to pull his children to come to him. But gosh, in the world of the Catholic faith, there's just so many dimensions and so many possibilities of art and feast days. And let me just stop with that example right there. And it's a little practical word maybe to your listeners. I've just seen the beauty of having the possibility of continuing to celebrate the church year with my own children or whomever, wherever they are in relationship to their faith and to Christian faith, Catholic faith. Turns out it's not that hard to say to somebody, want to come eat a bunch of great food and then have a cake in honor of St. Monica, just to go to a mother of long suffering patience. It's not just one example. Feasting, I think, is a fantastic example of a way that people can just continually be invited in, and it's not all resting on their decision to make the right decision and do the right thing. It's something more like, come and eat. The table's set, come and eat. And that is a really generous place to be able to sit in as a parent.
That's a fantastic way to end our conversation. Thank you so much for being on the show, Dr. Holly Taylor Coolman, Assistant Professor of Theology at Providence College and Senior Fellow at the Principium Institute. The book we've been talking about is Parenting, the Complex and Beautiful Vocation of Raising Children. Please make sure to go check that out. Holly, thank you again for being on the show.
Thank you so much. So much fun to talk with you guys.
This is The Uncommon Good, and we'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. It is wonderful that you're with us here. We hope that you got to listen to our wonderful interview with Holly Taylor Coolman. Parenting, the Complex and Beautiful Vocation of Raising Children was the book title. Bud, I'll just be honest, it was such a great conversation that we kind of ran over time. So we don't have a ton of time here at the end. I'm glad that we got to ask the questions that we did. Wonderful conversation. But if people want to join our prayer life here on Iowa Catholic Radio, a wonderful way to help parent your kids to that apprenticeship into heaven, what's ways that they can do that?
Yeah, if you're involved in the vocation of parenting or any sort of vocation, I think, prayer is an essential foundation for doing that well. You could point your kids to Iowa Catholic Radio. We broadcast the Rosary on air at 6 a.m., at 10 a.m., the Chapel of Divine Mercy at 2:55 in the afternoon, or you could gather the family around the hearth and use the Iowa Catholic Radio app to pray the Rosary together any time of the day.
I like that they get like those old, it's like the 1930s wooden thing, but you put an iPhone in it, and then we need to do an entire show sounding like great moments in church history one more time.
I love those old promos for radio shows or whatever, like how intently the family would be listening to the radio show. They're like
staring,
leaning in.
Wooden clock.
I'm sure that's how people listen to our show.
Yes, very, very intent. If you want to do things with family, you can go to iowacatholicradio.com, look at the events page. There's plenty to do. And of course, we are asking our Iowa Catholic Radio family to prayerfully consider giving to Iowa Catholic Radio. This ministry is not just the people behind the mics, behind the tables, or behind the desks. It is your ministry as well. You make it possible through your prayers, through your volunteer time, but very much so through your donations. We can't exist without your material support, and we want to say thank you for all those who do that. iowacatholicradio.com, the Iowa Catholic Radio app, or call 515-223-1150 or text 515-223-1150 in order to donate. Thank you for anybody who does. Thank you for people who consider it. But this is the way that we keep this ministry on the airwaves, ready to be listened to anywhere at any time on our affiliate stations. Bud, great job with the interview. I feel rejuvenated to go make some little apprentices for heaven.
Well, I know you mentioned like we spilled over a little bit, but it was one of those conversations where it could have gone longer too. easily.
A whole other hour. But this is the Uncommon Good. May Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace, reign in our hearts, family, city, state, solar system, galaxy, the whole kit and caboodle. This is the Uncommon Good, and we'll be back next week.
The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr is heard every week on wonderful Catholic stations like this one, and anytime on podcast. Just search for The Uncommon Good.
Support for Iowa Catholic Radio and The Uncommon Good provided by Mercy College of Health Sciences. Learn more at mchs.edu.